The year was 1881, and the wind that tore through Ash Hollow had teeth. It was an early autumn wind, born in the high plains and funneled down through the canyons, carrying a fine red dust that settled on everything and everyone. By dusk, the dust hung in the air like a bloody curtain, turning the last rays of the sun into a hazy, mournful glow. The town was battening down, not just against the coming cold, but against a chill that had nothing to do with the season. Shutters were latched, doors were barred. The main street, a wide slash of trampled earth, lay empty save for the skittering dance of a loose tumbleweed. Silas Cole felt the grit of that dust between his teeth as he rode. His horse, a steady bay mare named Bess, walked with her head low against the gusts. Silas sat slumped in the saddle, the leather creaking a familiar, weary rhythm. He was a man made of long lines and hard angles, his face weathered by sun and worry into something that looked older than his 30 years. His ranch, Dry Willow, was a good 5 miles out, and the ride into town was one he made only when necessity bit down hard. Tonight, it was biting to the bone. Tucked inside the worn canvas of his coat was a banknote, rolled tight and tied with a bit of twine. The paper was crisp with legal threats, the ink a stark, unforgiving black. It was a month overdue, a fact that Pike Harrow, the town's banker and aspiring king, would not let him forget. He passed the general store, its windows dark squares of nothing. He saw the flicker of a lamp behind the drawn curtains of the saloon and heard a burst of rough laughter, quickly muffled, as if even mirth was something to be hidden. Men who had shared a drink with him a season ago now turned their heads when he rode past, their wives, who once offered a slice of pie when he came for supplies, now hurried their children indoors at the sound of his horse's hooves. He was a marked man. The rumor it had spread faster than a prairie fire Cole's land was forfeit. Harrow was calling in the debt, and the drought had left Silas with nothing but skinny cattle and dry wells to pay it with. The unspoken law of Ash Hollow, a law enforced by Pike Harrow's quiet influence, was clear. Anyone who offered help to Silas Cole would find their own credit cut, their own supplies delayed, their own small kindnesses repaid with a cold shoulder from the rest of the community. He was being starved out, not with guns, but with silence, across town, in a place that smelled of old hay and new hope. Nora Hale was trying to hold back the night. Her classroom was a rented granary, a sturdy but drafty structure belonging to the church, by day. Its wide doors were thrown open to let in the light, and the space echoed with the hesitant sounds of children learning their letters, the sons and daughters of miners and blacksmiths who scratched a hard living from the unforgiving land. By night, it was just Nora, a single candle, and her ledgers. She was the town's temporary teacher, a title that meant her position was as precarious as the flame on her desk. To make ends meet, she practiced her true trade in the quiet hours bookbinding. A stack of worn Bibles and tattered storybooks lay on a nearby bench, awaiting her patient hands. Tonight, she was focused on the school's accounts. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, a stray strand of dark brown hair falling across her cheek. The town council had allotted her a pittance for supplies, and she was trying to stretch it, to make every penny count for chalk and slate pencils. The task required a clear head and a steady light. She trimmed the wick of the tallow candle with a small pair of scissors, and the flame jumped, casting her shadow, large and profound, against the rough-hewn wooden walls. The wick sputtered and hissed, a tiny, defiant sound in the great quiet. The air was thick with the mingled scents of melting tallow, the clean aroma of paper and glue from her bookbinding, and the sweet, earthy smell of damp straw packed into the cracks of the walls to keep out the wind. Outside, the wind howled a low, lonely song, but another sound soon joined it, the soft, rhythmic beat of horses' hooves moving at a walk. Nora froze, her pen hovering over the page. Her eyes lifted from the neat columns of figures and stared toward the gaps in the wallboards. She didn't need to see them to know who they were. They rode almost every night now, a handful of men, their faces wrapped in kerchiefs to hide them from the dust and the eyes of their neighbors. They worked for Pike Harrow, though no one ever said so aloud. They weren't lawmen, but they enforced Harrow's law. Their job was simple: to ride the streets after dark and take note of who was still awake, whose windows still showed a light. A light meant activity. It meant conversation. It could mean conspiracy. In Harrow's Ash Hollow, darkness was a sign of obedience. A lit window was a question he didn't like to see asked. The riders were his way of ensuring the town slept soundly, wrapped in a blanket of fear. The darkness thickened with their passing, a palpable weight that pressed in on the small, bright circle of Nora's candlelight. Silas had reached the edge of town, near the church. He'd intended to ride straight through, perhaps to the saloon, to see if he could find one man, just one, who would meet his eye and share a whiskey without looking over his shoulder. But he stopped. Ahead, nestled behind the stark white frame of the church, was the old granary, and through the thin cracks between the vertical planks of its walls, a single, impossibly bright sliver of light cut through the gloom. He didn't know why it held him. Perhaps it was just the only light he'd seen that wasn't trying to hide behind a curtain. It was a bold, unapologetic flame. He knew the teacher, Nora Hale, used the granary. He'd seen her from a distance, a quiet, serious woman who herded her flock of dusty children with a gentle but firm hand. He knew she took in mending and bookbinding work, a woman trying to make her own way, just as he was. A fool's errand, some might say, for both of them. He nudged Bess forward, the mare's steps muffled by the thick dust. He dismounted, his boots making no sound, and tied the reins to a low-hanging branch of a cottonwood tree whose leaves rustled like dry whispers. He moved closer to the granary, staying in the deep shadows cast by the church steeple. He found a wider gap in the boards and peered through. He saw her then. She was bent over a rough table, her back mostly to him. The candlelight softened the lines of her face, catching the curve of her cheek and the deep concentration in her eyes. Her hands, delicate but capable, moved with a practiced grace, first dipping a pen into an inkwell, then mending the spine of a book with needle and thread. She was a small island of order and diligence in a world that felt like it was crumbling into chaos. For a long moment, Silas simply watched, the cold knot of worry in his gut loosening just a fraction. Here was someone else who refused to let the darkness win. Here was another soul working late, not out of greed or malice, but simply to survive, to create something whole in a broken world. Nora felt a change in the air. It wasn't a sound. Not exactly. It was a stillness, a focused attention that cut through the random moaning of the wind. The fine hairs on the back of her neck prickled. She put down her pen, her heart beginning a slow, heavy beat against her ribs. The riders had already passed. She had counted the hoofbeats. This was something else, a presence. She rose slowly from her stool, her own shadow shrinking and growing on the wall as she moved away from the candle. She crept to the heavy granary door, which was secured by a simple wooden latch on the inside. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for it. She didn't lift the latch. Instead, she pressed her eye to a small knothole in the wood. At first, she saw only the oppressive dark. Then, a shape detached itself from the deeper shadows of the church. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, standing as still as the cottonwood tree he was tethered to. It was Silas Cole. She recognized the worn slope of his shoulders, the determined set of his jaw she'd seen from across the street. She saw the exhaustion etched on his face, but she also saw something else, a deep, profound loneliness that mirrored her own. She knew the stories. She'd heard the whispers in the general store, seen the pitying looks sent her way when she'd accepted a damaged book from him for repair last month. "Don't get tangled up with that one," the storekeeper's wife had advised, her voice low. "Pike Harrow has his eye on Dry Willow." He wasn't looking at the knothole. His gaze was fixed on the thin cracks in the wall, on the light that was spilling from them. He was looking at her light. In his eyes, she saw not a threat, but a kind of desperate thirst, as if he were a man dying in the desert who had just stumbled upon a single drop of water, and in that moment, Nora Hale understood everything. She understood that her small candle was not just a tool for her work. Tonight, it was a signal, a target, a liability. It was a beacon of defiance that could bring ruin not just upon her, but upon the man standing in the dark, who looked at it as if it were the last star in a dying sky. Her decision was instant. She lifted the heavy wooden bar, her movements swift and silent. The door groaned open, just a few inches, a narrow gap separating the warm, candlelit air from the cold, windy night. Silas started, his hand instinctively dropping to the handle of the Colt tucked into his belt before he realized who it was. He saw her face in the sliver of opening, her eyes wide and serious in the flickering light. Her voice was barely a whisper, carried on the wind but clear as a bell. "No lights tonight," she ordered, though it sounded more like a plea. He didn't ask why. He didn't need to. He had seen the riders. He knew the rules of this new, silent war. He saw the understanding in her eyes. She knew he was the reason the riders were out, the reason a single candle flame had become a dangerous provocation. She was putting herself at risk, even with this small interaction. She spoke again, her voice even lower. "Light calls trouble." It was the simplest, truest thing he had heard all week. Light called trouble. And he was trouble. He had brought the darkness to this town, and it was his responsibility not to let its shadow fall on her. He gave a single, sharp nod. His eyes met hers, and in that brief, silent glance a pact was made. An alliance was forged in the space between a flickering flame and an encroaching darkness. He saw her step back from the door, her silhouette momentarily blocking the light. He heard the soft click as the door was latched from the inside. Then, through the cracks in the boards, he watched as the warm, golden sliver of light, the only light in Ash Hollow that had dared to burn openly, vanished. A soft puff, and it was gone. The granary became just another dark shape against a dark sky. The wind howled, seeming to celebrate its victory, but Silas Cole didn't feel defeated. As he turned and walked back to his horse, the deep, oppressive blackness of the night felt a little less lonely. The days that followed settled into a quiet, watchful rhythm, a duet of survival played on opposite ends of Ash Hollow. For Nora Hale, the daylight hours were filled with the scuffing of little boots and the chalky dust of learning. She taught the miners' children in the granary, her voice a steady, patient counterpoint to the prairie wind rattling the walls. She showed them how the letter A stood like a proud little house, and house was a snake in the grass. These were children whose hands were already calloused, whose eyes held a weariness that didn't belong to the young. They came to her smelling of coal dust and wood smoke, and she gave them the clean, crisp world of words, a place where a person could travel 1,000 miles just by turning a page. In the evenings, when the children were gone and the granary was hers alone, she returned to her own work, under the cautious light of a single, well-guarded lamp kept far from the walls. She'd mend the town's wounded books with nimble fingers. She stitched torn pages, reinforced crumbling spines with fresh linen, and pressed loose covers back into place. Each repaired book was a small victory against the decay that seemed to be eating at the heart of the town, a quiet act of preservation. She worked until her eyes burned and her back ached, saving every coin to see her through the winter. For Silas Cole, the days were a grim accounting. The drought had baked his pastures to the color of old bone. The water at Dry Willow Creek had dwindled to a muddy trickle, not enough to sustain his herd. Each morning he rode out, not with the easy gait of a man surveying his prosperity, but with the tight, anxious posture of a man counting his losses. He'd stand among his cattle, the bony ridges of their hips and spines stark beneath their hides, and do the hard math of survival. So much hay left, so many weeks until the first snow. The price of feed in town was extortion, another lever Pike Harrow could use to apply pressure. He spent his hours mending fences that enclosed nothing but dust, his hammer blows echoing in the vast, empty silence. The loneliness of the place was a physical presence, as real as the heat shimmering off the cracked earth. It was a loneliness he had chosen, or so he told himself. after the fire, after Eli. But now, it felt less like a choice and more like a cage. The pressure from Pike Harrow was relentless and impersonal. Another letter arrived, delivered by a boy who dropped it in the dirt by the gate and galloped away as if the very soil of Dry Willow were cursed. This one wasn't handwritten. It was printed on heavy, cream-colored paper with the clean, sharp letters of a printing press, a symbol of modern, efficient cruelty. It spoke of interest compounding, of clauses and subclauses, of foreclosure proceedings. The words were a legal cage, tightening around him. At the bottom, where a signature should have been, was only a stamp. Harrow Keogh. And sealing the envelope was a disc of black wax, pressed with the banker's initial, like a single, sightless eye. Silas read it once, his jaw tight, then folded it and tucked it away with the other. A growing collection of paper chains that bound him to a fate he was trying desperately to outrun. The interest on top of interest felt like a hangman's knot, pulling a little tighter with every sunrise. They met a week later at the public well in the center of town. It was the only source of deep, clean water for miles, a place no one could avoid. Silas was filling his water barrels, the winch groaning under the weight of the bucket. Nora was approaching with 2 pails of her own. Walking with the steady, unhurried pace, she did everything. He saw her coming, and for a moment, his hands froze on the rope. He felt the eyes of Mrs. Gable, the blacksmith's wife, who was pointedly shaking out a rug on her porch nearby. He felt the stare of 2 ranchers who had stopped their conversation to watch. To be seen talking to him was to declare an allegiance, and no one in Ash Hollow could afford an allegiance to a failing man. Nora didn't hesitate. She walked directly to the well, setting her pails down with a soft thud. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice clear and calm, carrying easily in the quiet air. "Miss Hale," he managed, his own voice sounding rough to his ears. She held out a book wrapped in brown paper. "I finished this for you." He wiped his wet hands on his trousers before taking it. He unwrapped it carefully. It was his mother's Bible. The one that had survived the fire, its cover scorched and its spine broken. He had given it to Nora without much hope, more as an excuse to speak to her than with any real expectation it could be saved. But now, it was whole again. The cover was new, a simple, sturdy piece of dark leather that felt solid and true in his hands. The pages, once loose and threatening to scatter, were bound tightly. She had even saved the scorched parts of the original cover, inlaying a small, blackened piece into the new leather, a scar that was not hidden but honored. I don't have the coin right now, Miss Hale," he said, the words tasting like ash. "But I'll make it right." "You already have," she said, her eyes meeting his. "You brought me the work. That's payment enough for now." She picked up the rope for the well bucket. "The Reverend was asking after you." It was a simple statement, but it hung in the air between them, a reminder of community, of the church he hadn't set foot in for 3 years. "I'm sure he was," Silas said, his tone flat. Her gaze was direct, unwavering. "He told me I ought to be careful who I associate with." Silas felt a flush of anger, not at her, but at the town, at the pastor, at the whole web of whispers that sought to isolate him. "He's not wrong." A small, sad smile touched Nora's lips. "I told him light is supposed to shine in dark places." She began to lower the bucket into the well, the rope sliding through her hands. The moment was over. The conversation was done, but the words remained. Light is supposed to shine in dark places. He stood there, holding the mended Bible, long after she had filled her pails and walked away, her back straight, her steps even, leaving him in a silence that felt, for the first time, not entirely empty. The talk in the saloon that night was thick as the smoke from cheap cigars. Men who owed their own small fortunes to Pike Harrow's bank were the loudest. "Cole's place is dark as a tomb every night." One of them slurred, wiping foam from his mustache. "Not a flicker of light. Man's got something to hide, I tell you." "Hiding from his debts," another chimed in, and there was a round of gruff laughter. Or maybe his ghosts. Ain't been right since his brother passed. The talk coiled around Silas's name, making him into a specter, a cautionary tale. His darkness was proof of his guilt. His silence was an admission of defeat. They drank Harrow's whiskey and spoke Harrow's words. And with every glass, the noose of public opinion tightened around Silas Cole's neck. A few days later, Silas found himself in the general store, picking up a sack of flour and some coffee. He avoided looking at the ledger on the counter, where his name was underlined in red with the word "cash only" written beside it. As the storekeeper weighed his flour, Silas's eyes fell on a crate of cheap tallow candles. They were thin, lumpy things, probably smelling of animal fat when they burned, nothing like the clean beeswax candles his mother had once kept for special occasions. On impulse, he pointed. "I'll take a bundle of those." The storekeeper raised an eyebrow. "Didn't figure you for a man who did much reading after sundown, Silas." The question was casual, but the implication was clear. Why does a man who lives in darkness need candles? Rats in the barn. Silas lied, the words feeling clumsy in his mouth. Need to set some traps. Can't do it in the dark. It was a plausible enough excuse. The storekeeper shrugged, wrapped a dozen candles in a piece of newspaper, and added it to the bill. Silas paid, his pouch feeling considerably lighter, and left, back outside. He didn't put the candles in his saddlebags. He tied the bundle with a leather thong to the back of his saddle, where it bounced with every step Bess took. He didn't light them that night, or the next. He didn't even bring them inside. The candles stayed on his saddle. A silent, unlit promise. He'd bought them, he realized. Not for the rats. He'd bought them as a reason. A flimsy excuse to have a conversation with Nora Hale. To thank her, to tell her. He didn't know what, but the words wouldn't come. And so the candles remained, a symbol of a promise he didn't know how to keep, a light he was afraid to touch. He saw her again as the next week drew to a close. He was leaving the blacksmith's, having gotten a new shoe for Bess, when he saw her dismissing her students for the day. She stood in the doorway of the granary, a small, resolute figure, as the children scattered into the dusty twilight. He knew this might be his only chance to speak to her without the whole town watching. He led Bess over, his heart thumping a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. "Miss Hale," he said, stopping a respectful distance away. She turned, a flicker of surprise in her eyes that was quickly replaced by her usual calm composure. "Mr. Cole." He fumbled for words, his hand going to the bundle of candles still tied to his saddle. I came to pay you for the Bible." He reached into his pocket, but she held up a hand. "I told you that wasn't necessary yet." "A man pays his debts," he said, the words having a bitter double meaning. He looked down at the ground, at the scuffed toes of his boots. "And I wanted to thank you for what you said. At the well." The silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of the wind and the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer. She looked at him, her gaze taking in the weary lines around his eyes, the tension in his shoulders, the unlit candles. She seemed to see right through the rough exterior to the desperate struggle beneath. Without a word, she stepped closer. He thought she was going to refuse his thanks, to send him on his way. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her apron. Her movement was so quick, so subtle, he barely registered it. She slipped something small and hard into the pocket of his canvas coat. Her fingers brushed his side for a fraction of a second, a touch so light it was like the brush of a bird's wing, yet it sent a jolt through him. He looked down, confused. She stepped back, her hands now clasped in front of her. "When you need it," she said, her voice low and steady, meant only for him. "You light one, but you choose the right time." He reached into his pocket and his fingers closed around a small, rectangular box. He knew without looking what it was. A box of matches. He looked at her, his throat too tight to speak. It wasn't just a box of matches. It was trust. It was a statement. She was giving him the means to make a spark, to create the very light she had warned him against. She was telling him that she trusted him to know when the darkness was a shield and when it was a prison. Choose the right time, she repeated softly. Then she turned, went back inside the granary, and gently closed the door, leaving him standing alone in the fading light of Ash Hollow, the weight of a dozen unlit candles on his saddle and the small, powerful promise of a flame in his pocket. The guilt was a brand, a mark seared into Silas Cole's soul that 3 years had not cooled. It came on him most nights, but it was worst when the wind blew from the east, carrying the phantom smell of smoke. He would be mending a harness or staring into the cold embers of his hearth, and suddenly he would be back there. 3 years ago. The air is hot, thick with the screams of terrified cattle and the furious crackle of burning pine. The barn, his father's barn, is a roaring mouth of orange and red, spitting black smoke into the night sky. He is outside, his face blistered by the heat, his lungs raw. He is shouting a name. Eli, the wind eats the sound. He sees a shape in the open barn door, a silhouette against the inferno. His younger brother, Eli, his face a pale oval of terror. Eli, who was supposed to be checking on a sick calf. "Get out!" Silas screams, his voice cracking. But Eli doesn't move. He's frozen, mesmerized by the horror. Silas starts to run toward him, but a section of the hayloft roof collapses in a volcano of sparks and falling timbers. The doorway is gone. He is thrown backward by the concussion of air, landing hard in the dirt. He scrambles up, still shouting, his hands raw from beating at a fire that is already an unstoppable beast. He remembers the smell, not just of wood and hay, but of something else, something acrid and chemical. He remembers the overturned oil barrel, not 10 feet from where the first flames had been spotted. It had been full that morning, for the lamps and the machinery. The town paper, a single sheet printed weekly, had called it a tragic accident. The marshal had nodded sagely, spoken of the dangers of a dry season and the carelessness that comes with exhaustion. An unfortunate placement of an oil barrel, a stray spark from a dropped lantern. Perhaps. No one was to blame, but Silas knew better. The blame lived in his bones. He should have moved the barrel. He should have gone to the barn himself. He should have run faster. He should have been the one in the doorway when the roof came down. He had survived. And Eli, the laughing, hopeful one, the one who was going to be a doctor, was gone. The guilt was a physical weight, a hot piece of iron he carried in his chest. Nora Hale smelled that same acrid scent one morning as she arrived at the granary. It was faint, nearly lost beneath the smell of dew-damp dust and the distant aroma of baking bread from the town bakery. But it was there, sharp and unnatural. She paused, her hand on the heavy wooden door, her senses on high alert. Her gaze swept the area behind the granary, a patch of weeds and packed earth where her students sometimes played during their breaks. And then she saw it, tucked behind a low-lying juniper bush, almost completely hidden from the main path, was a barrel. A dark, metal oil barrel, identical to the one sold at the general store and used on every ranch and farm for miles. It was new. She could see the lack of rust around its seams. A small, dark stain spread in the dirt beneath its spigot, confirming it was not empty. Her blood ran cold. It wasn't the barrel itself that terrified her. It was its placement. It was the deliberate, calculated malice of it. Her classroom was a wooden tinderbox filled with straw, paper, and dry books. At night, she was the only one here, working by candlelight. An accident, a dropped candle, a sudden fire, and an oil barrel. Conveniently placed to explain the speed and intensity of the blaze, the narrative wrote itself, and it was a story designed to ruin her, or worse. It was a threat aimed not just at her livelihood, but at her life, and it was constructed to look like her own foolish mistake. Someone wanted to frame her, to blame the fire on her candle. She did not scream or run for help. Her fear sharpened her mind, honing it to a fine point. She forced herself to walk calmly toward the barrel, her eyes scanning the ground. The earth was hardpan, difficult to read, but near the base of the juniper bush, in a patch of softer, damper soil, she found what she was looking for. A single, perfect boot print. It was deep, made by a heavy man, but it was the sole that held her attention. The heel was worn, but hammered into the leather were small metal cleats to give the wearer purchase on unsteady ground. Most were simple circles or squares. This one had a cleat in the center shaped like a small, sharp cross. Her mind raced. She had seen that mark before, where dusting the erasers after school, looking out the granary's small window. She'd seen it in the mud outside the saloon, on the wooden platform of the new railroad depot. It was the boot print of the private guards Pike Harrow had hired to protect his railroad interests. They were hard men from out of town, loyal only to Harrow's coin, known for their brutish efficiency. They were the same men who rode through the streets at night, counting the lit windows. The connection was as clear and solid as a bar of steel. This wasn't a random act of spite. This was a message from Pike Harrow, miles away, at Dry Willow. Silas was experiencing an echo of his own past. The sun was setting, bleeding purple and orange across the vast, empty sky. He was walking the fence line near his new, smaller barn, a structure he'd built himself, timber by painful timber, a shadow of the one he'd lost. A flicker of movement in the cottonwoods near the creek caught his eye. It wasn't a deer. It was a man, keeping low, moving from the cover of one tree to the next, his shape indistinct in the deepening twilight. Silas dropped into a crouch, his body reacting before his mind had a chance to catch up. His hand went to his Colt, the feel of the worn wooden grip a cold comfort. He watched as the figure crept closer, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. The man stopped at the edge of the trees, just beyond rifle range, and raised something to his face, for a heartbeat. A glint of last light caught on metal. It wasn't binoculars. It was the long, dark barrel of a rifle. The lurker wasn't scouting. He was watching, waiting. A hot, familiar rage surged in Silas's throat. He wanted to stand up, to shout a challenge, to fire a warning shot into the dirt. He wanted to make the coward show his face. 3 years of buried fury boiled to the surface. This was his land. He would not be hunted on his own property. He thought of the matches in his pocket, the candles on his saddle. He could go inside, light a lantern, make himself a clear target, and dare the man to take his shot. A straight fight, an honest fight. Then he remembered Nora's voice, a whisper in the windy dark. Light calls trouble. He remembered her hand on his coat, the small box of matches she had given him. Choose the right time. This was not the right time. This was exactly what they wanted. They wanted him to make a move, to fire his gun, to light a lamp, to give them an excuse, an altercation. A panicked rancher firing wildly in the dark. Another story for the town marshal, another nail for his coffin. He swallowed the curses that rose in his throat. He forced his hand to relax on the grip of his pistol. He stayed low, melting back into the shadows of his own barn, his eyes never leaving the figure in the trees. He would not light the candle. He would not give the enemy the target they craved. He would wait. He would watch. He would endure. He would use the darkness they were forcing upon him as his own shield. After a long, tense 10 minutes, the figure seemed to give up, melting back into the woods as silently as he had appeared. Silas stayed there until full dark had fallen, the cold of the earth seeping into his bones, a cold that was nothing compared to the icy resolve forming in his heart. The next afternoon, they came. Pike Harrow did not ride alone. He arrived in a smart, black buggy pulled by a handsome gray gelding, a stark contrast to the dust and poverty of Dry Willow. 2 of his railroad guards rode on horseback beside him, the men sitting tall in their saddles, their hands resting near their holstered pistols. One of them wore boots with cross-shaped cleats. Silas met them in the yard. He had been expecting this. He stood his ground, his arms crossed over his chest, his face an unreadable mask of stone. Harrow remained in his buggy, looking down at Silas as if he were an interesting but distasteful insect. He was a man in his 50s, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, his face clean-shaven, his graying hair neatly combed. He looked like a church deacon, but his eyes were as cold and dead as river stones. "Cole," Harrow said, his voice smooth and devoid of any emotion. "A difficult season." "It's been dry," Silas replied, his own voice flat. "Indeed." Harrow produced a sheaf of papers from a leather satchel. "Which brings me to the unfortunate matter of your loan, and a new development. I've been speaking with the insurance underwriters for this territory." He let the words hang in the air. "They are concerned about the risk." "Risk," Silas said, though he knew what was coming. "Fires," Harrow said, a flicker of something like enjoyment in his cold eyes. "This land seems prone to them. A tragedy. What happened to your brother?" "It would be a catastrophe if it were to happen again." He tapped the papers with a manicured finger. "The underwriters have added a new clause to all policies in this area, effective immediately. In the event of a second fire on a property within 5 years, the policy is rendered null and void. All claims denied." Silas felt the trap spring. It was elegant in its cruelty. "And," Harrow continued, his voice dropping slightly, "as you know, the terms of your loan stipulate that the property must remain fully insured. If the insurance is withdrawn—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. If the insurance was void, the loan would be called in immediately. The land would be his. Pike Harrow would win without ever firing a shot. All he needed was another fire. A small one would do. Silas's hands curled into fists at his sides, his knuckles white. The rage he had suppressed the night before returned. A white-hot wave. He wanted to drag Harrow from his fine buggy and break him in two. He took a half-step forward, a low growl starting in his chest. The two guards straightened in their saddles, their hands moving from resting to ready. But before he could say or do anything, a slight movement from the shadows of the porch of his small cabin caught his eye. He had been so focused on Harrow, he hadn't noticed her arrive. Nora Hale stood there, half hidden behind a support beam. She must have ridden over, heard the buggy, and concealed herself. Her face was pale, but her eyes were burning with a fierce intensity. She gave him the slightest shake of her head, a command as clear as if she had shouted it. "Don't!" He looked back at Harrow, the rage still churning inside him. But now it was tempered by Nora's silent plea. He would not give them the satisfaction. He would not give them the violence they were trying to provoke. "You'll get your money." "Harrow," Silas said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Harrow smiled, a thin, bloodless stretching of his lips. "I have no doubt of that. Cole, one way or another." He signaled to his driver. The buggy turned in a tight circle, and they rode away, leaving Silas standing in a cloud of red dust, the legal and physical threats hanging in the air like poison. He stood there for a long time, his fists still clenched, his body trembling with the effort of control. When he finally turned, Nora was stepping out of the shadows. She wasn't looking at him. Her gaze was fixed on the piece of paper she held in her hand, braced against the rough wood of the porch wall. In her other hand, she held a small, worn nub of a pencil. Her fingers were flying across the page, her script small and tight as she furiously scribbled, not in the elegant cursive she taught her students, but in a rushed, angular shorthand. He could hear the scratching of the graphite against the paper. She was writing down every word, every threat, every legal term. While he had been ready to fight with his fists, she had been fighting with her mind. She looked up, her eyes meeting his, and in their depths, he saw not fear, but a cold, burning determination that matched his own. The darkness had come to them, but they were standing in it together, and she was remembering everything. The night did not fall. It seeped up from the ground, a cold, black tide that swallowed the last bruised colors of the sunset. With it came the wind, no longer just a carrier of dust, but of something more sinister. It was a greasy, chemical smell that coated the back of the throat, the scent of kerosene. It clung to the air, a promise of violence. Tonight, the whispers of Pike Harrow's threats would be given form. Inside the small cabin at Dry Willow, every nerve in Silas Cole's body was a wire pulled taut. He sat in the dark, not on a chair, but on the floor with his back against the wall, a position that offered the smallest silhouette. He held his Winchester rifle across his knees, its cool, heavy weight, a familiar burden. The waiting was the hardest part. It was a hollow, ringing silence filled only by the howl of the wind and the frantic thumping of his own heart. He was alone, a single man against a machine of greed and power, and the darkness felt less like a shield and more like a tomb. Then he heard it. Not the approach of enemies, but the signal. 3 soft, deliberate knocks on the solid wood of the barn door. Thump, thump, thump! It was their agreed-upon rhythm, a sound so quiet it could have been a branch brushing against the wood. But he knew it instantly. It was Nora. He moved without a sound, a shadow within shadows. His boots, the leather worn soft, made no noise on the packed earth floor. He unbarred the cabin door, opening it just enough to slip through, and pulled it shut behind him. The air outside was colder, the smell of kerosene stronger. He saw her near the corner of the barn, a figure made of moonlight and resolve. She had her own rifle, a smaller model, held not with fear but with a firm, practiced competence. She didn't waste time with greetings. Her voice was a low, urgent whisper that cut through the wind. "No lights tonight." She repeated the words that had become their creed, their strategy for survival. She looked toward the dark line of the fence that separated his land from the empty prairie. "They need a flame. They need a target to blame it on. We give them nothing to see." He nodded, understanding completely. Harrow's men weren't just coming to set a fire. They were coming to create a story. The desperate rancher, driven mad by his debts, sets fire to his own barn for the insurance money. Or the careless teacher, working late by candlelight, accidentally burns down the property. They needed a light, his or hers, to make the lie plausible. Tonight, Dry Willow would be as dark as the inside of a grave. He went back inside the cabin and began the final preparations. He took the single thick curtain he owned and secured it over the small window, making sure not a single crack of light could escape. He took a heavy horse blanket from his cot and stuffed it along the bottom of the door, sealing the gap. The cabin was plunged into an absolute, suffocating blackness. For a moment, blind and disoriented, a surge of panic tightened his chest. It was the darkness of the fire, the black smoke that had taken Eli. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing the memory down. When he opened them again, he did not try to see. He listened. He waited. Slowly, painfully, his world began to return. The impenetrable black softened into shades of gray. The square of the window became a slightly less dark rectangle, a sliver of faint, silvery starlight found a pinhole in the curtain, casting a single, ghostly beam across the room. He let his breathing slow, let his eyes drink in the faint light until the table, the stove, and the cot became familiar shapes once more. He was no longer blind. He was learning to see in a new language, the language of the night outside. Nora did the same, pressing herself into the deep shadow cast by the barn wall. She tracked the stars, their cold, distant light offering a map of the sky but no warmth. Her senses were stretched to their breaking point. She listened for the snap of a twig, the nervous whicker of Silas's horse in the corral, any sound that was out of place. Her breath plumed in the air, a tiny, fleeting cloud. The rifle in her hands was a cold, hard reality. She had never fired it in anger, had only used it to hunt rabbits for the pot, but she had practiced. Her father, a man who believed a woman's best defense was her own 2 hands, had taught her to shoot straight and true. She prayed she would not have to tonight. The sound, when it came, was so subtle she almost missed it. A faint scraping noise from the direction of the fence, metal on wood, the buckle of a saddlebag, perhaps, or a spur. She held her breath, her ears straining. Then came a soft, heavy thud, followed by another. 2 of them. They hadn't ridden in. They had left their horses somewhere down the line and were coming in on foot. 2 shapes, darker than the surrounding night, resolved themselves near the fence. They moved in a low crouch, a clumsy imitation of a predator's stalk. They paused, surveying the silent, dark ranch. Nora could feel their frustration, their confusion. Where was the light? Where was the target? They had expected a lamp in the window, a sign of life. They found only an unnerving, complete darkness. One of the men gestured toward the barn. They began to move forward, their steps slow and cautious. Nora could hear the faint clink of glass against metal. A lantern, unlit, and the sloshing of liquid in a can. Kerosene. They had brought their own. They didn't need Silas's lamp after all. They only needed his barn. Nora knew she had to act, to disrupt them, to break their momentum. To her right lay a small pile of rocks she had gathered earlier that day. Remnants of a new foundation Silas had been digging. Her hand closed around one, its surface smooth and cool, its weight perfect. She saw her target, not the men themselves, but a glint of moonlight on brass. 30 yards away, a large cowbell hanging from the neck of Silas's lead steer, a placid animal named Judge. She rose to a half-crouch, her arm a blur in the darkness. She threw with all her strength, not with the wild heave of panic, but with the focused, practiced motion of a girl who had spent her childhood skipping stones across a creek. The rock sailed through the air, a silent, deadly messenger. It struck the bell with a loud, discordant clang that shattered the night. The effect was instantaneous and chaotic. Judge let out a startled, deep-throated bellow of protest. The other cattle, startled from their doze by the sudden noise and the panic of their leader, lurched to their feet. There was a frantic shuffling of hooves, the clatter of horns, and a series of low, anxious moans. The entire small herd, a dozen animals, surged as one, moving directly away from the sound and directly into the path of the two intruders. The men cursed, stumbling backward as a wall of flesh and shadow moved toward them. They were no longer hunters. They were obstacles. The cattle flowed around them, their large, dark bodies creating a moving, unpredictable screen that completely blocked their view of the barn. The diversion had worked better than Nora could have hoped. That was Silas's cue. While the men were pinned down, their attention fixed on the shifting cattle, he moved. He slipped from the side of the cabin, keeping low to the ground, his body a fluid line of motion. He was no longer a rancher. He was a part of the night, as silent and deadly as a mountain lion. He ignored the men, his focus entirely on his objective. The glint he saw was not from a star. It was the damp sheen of spilled kerosene on the side of the barn. He could smell it, raw and potent, and next to the damp patch, a small pile of oil-soaked rags. He reached the corner of the barn and saw the can. It was a 5-gallon tin, heavy and full. He didn't try to lift it. He got his shoulder low and pushed. The can tipped, glugging its contents onto the thirsty ground, the liquid spreading in a dark, foul-smelling pool, safely away from the wooden walls. He then moved to the barn door. It was a double door, held shut by a simple wooden bar on the outside. But he had prepared for this. Lying on the ground was a heavy wedge of oak he had cut that afternoon. He slipped inside, into the familiar darkness that smelled of hay and animals, and pulled the doors shut. He lifted the heavy bar on the inside and settled it into its iron brackets. Then he took the oak wedge and hammered it into place between the bottom of the door and the hard-packed floor with the heel of his boot. The barn was now a fortress, sealed from the inside. He heard them approach, their steps now hurried and angry. They had gotten clear of the cattle and realized they'd been tricked. He heard one of them grunt as he tried the exterior bar, finding it gone. "It's barred from the inside," a rough voice snarled. "He's in there," the other voice hissed. "Burn him out." Silas stood in the darkness, his back pressed against the solid wood of the door, his rifle held ready. He could hear them fumbling with the rags, the metallic scrape of the now empty kerosene can being thrown aside. "Got a match?" "Yeah, hold the lantern." There was a moment of fumbling, followed by a sound that made every muscle in Silas's body clench, the harsh, unmistakable scry-ape of a match head being struck against a rough surface. A tiny, fragile spark flared to life in the darkness. For a single, eternal second, Silas saw the face of one of the men illuminated in its glow, a mean, rat-like face with a scraggly beard, his eyes wide with malicious glee. The man cupped his hands around the flame, trying to shield it, bringing it down toward the pile of rags. And then the wind, which had been their enemy, became their savior. A sudden, violent gust tore around the corner of the barn. It howled like a hungry wolf, a physical force that ripped and tore at the night. The tiny flame, the seed of their destruction, danced wildly for a second. It flickered, it guttered, and then it was gone, snuffed out as if by an invisible hand. Damnation! The word was a raw, frustrated curse, spat into the wind. The whole box is damp. That was Nora's signal. The plan had been for Silas to secure the barn, and for her to be the final, decisive answer. She raised her rifle, the wooden stock firm against her shoulder. She did not aim at the cursing shapes by the barn door. She aimed at the cold, indifferent stars above. She took a breath, held it, and gently squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle shot was deafening. It was not the sound of a pistol, but the deep, authoritative roar of a hunting rifle, a sound that spoke of power and distance. An orange flash from the muzzle momentarily lit up the entire yard, freezing the two men in a tableau of shock and terror. The sound echoed off the distant hills, a thunderous announcement that the occupants of Dry Willow were not helpless sheep. They were armed, they were waiting, and they were fighting back. For a moment, there was only a stunned, ringing silence. Then, panic erupted. The two men scrambled away from the barn as if the wood itself were on fire. They stumbled over each other in their haste to get away. "It's an ambush!" one of them shrieked. They fled, their clumsy stealth forgotten. They crashed through the underbrush, their only thought to escape. Silas heard them crashing through the creek bed, followed by the frantic, panicked sound of horses' hooves galloping away into the night. One of them shouted to the other, his voice thin and reedy with fear, carried back on the wind. "Forget it, let's go, we tell Pike it was a bust." Then they were gone. The sound of their retreat was swallowed by the wind, leaving only a profound, ringing silence. The smell of gunpowder, sharp and clean, now mingled with the foul scent of kerosene. Silas slowly, carefully, unbarred the barn door and stepped out. Nora was already there, walking toward him from the shadows, her rifle held loosely in her hand. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They simply stood together in the cold starlight, their shared breath misting in the air, listening to the vast, empty silence of the land they had. For one more night, called their own. The first light of dawn was pale and unforgiving. It revealed a world washed in shades of gray and brown, a yard scarred by the night's events. The air, scoured by the wind, was clean and cold, but a faint, ghosting scent of kerosene still clung to the ground near the barn, a stain on the morning. While Silas checked on the spooked cattle, their eyes still wide and white-rimmed, Nora began her search. She did not walk. She hunted, her eyes scanning every inch of the trampled earth where their assailants had fled. She moved with the quiet, focused intensity of a woman who knew that survival was not found in grand gestures, but in the careful gathering of small, overlooked details. Near the creek bed, caught on the thorns of a mesquite bush, she found it. It was not much, just a scrap of dark leather, no bigger than her palm, a piece of a work glove, torn off in a panicked scramble. But it wasn't the leather that made her draw in a sharp, cold breath. It was the mud. Caked into the seams was a thick, reddish-brown clay, a distinctive color unlike the dark, loamy soil of Dry Willow. It was the color of rust and blood, the unmistakable mud of the Clay Ridge mine, a mine owned and operated by a subsidiary of Pike Harrow's railroad company. She carefully wrapped the scrap in her handkerchief, the first piece of solid, physical evidence, a thread, red and muddy, leading directly back to the source. She knew it wasn't enough. She needed more than a thread. She needed a rope, the memory of the boot print behind the granary, with its unique cross-shaped cleat, burned in her mind. She had to know if it matched the men who worked for Harrow. The thought of walking into the heart of town, into the territory of the beast itself, sent a tremor of fear through her. but the fear was overwhelmed by a cold, clear anger. She saddled her mare and rode into Ash Hollow, the small, precious bundle tucked safely in her pocket. The railroad office was a new, arrogant structure of raw pine that still smelled of sap. It stood next to the depot, a symbol of Harrow's power, a declaration that he was the future of this town. One of his guards, a hulking man with a sullen face, leaned against the porch railing, whittling a piece of wood. Nora's heart hammered against her ribs. She could feel his eyes on her as she dismounted, a lazy, contemptuous gaze that missed nothing. She needed a reason to be there, a reason to be looking at the ground. Her mind worked frantically. As she stepped onto the wooden boardwalk, she let a small, inconsequential button slip from her fingers. "Oh, bother," she said, her voice a pitch higher than usual. The button bounced and rolled under the railing. She knelt, pretending to search for it, her head bent low. Her eyes, however, were not on the button. They were scanning the dusty ground beneath the porch steps, an area protected from the wind, where footprints were deep and clear. And there it was, not one, but a dozen prints, churned into the dirt by men coming and going from the office. And in the center of each heel, clear as a cattle brand, was the small, sharp indentation of a metal cross. Her breath caught in her throat. A match. The second thread. She found her button, stood up, dusted off her skirt, and gave the guard a tight, polite smile. He grunted, not bothering to look up from his whittling. She turned and walked away, her steps measured and calm. But inside, her mind was racing. Silas, meanwhile, was conducting his own grim search. He followed the path of the intruder's flight, his eyes missing nothing. He knew the land, every rock and gully. He knew what a man in a hurry might drop or discard. He found their trail near the creek, a place of thick willows and sharp rocks. And there, snagged on a low branch as if offered up by the land itself, was a piece of paper. It was folded, but not sealed. He took it down, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. It was a requisition form, printed with the words, "From the Warehouse of Harrow Company." The neat, sloping script was chillingly mundane. It detailed a single item, kerosene, 5 gallons. Below, a signature authorized the withdrawal. But it was the date at the top of the page that made the blood pound in his temples. It was dated the day before the attack. This was not a crime of opportunity. It was a planned, calculated act of terror, authorized and supplied by Pike Harrow's own company, the third thread. They met in the shadowy quiet of Nora's granary classroom late that afternoon. The children were gone, and the only sounds were the whisper of the wind and the frantic scratching of Nora's pencil. She laid the glove fragment on the table. Silas placed the requisition slip beside it. She drew a careful sketch of the boot print, the cross-shaped cleat, a stark, damning symbol. They looked at the collection of evidence, a silent testament to Harrow's guilt, a glove with mine mud, a boot print from his guards, a fuel order from his warehouse. It was a strong chain, but they both knew it might not be strong enough. A clever lawyer could tear it apart. They were still missing the one thing they truly needed, a direct link between Harrow and the men he paid to do his dirty work. "His warehouse," Nora said, her voice barely a whisper. "The slip came from his warehouse. It's on the edge of town. Watch day and night." Silas countered, his voice low and rough. "We'd never get in." Nora's eyes had a distant, calculating look. "He doesn't keep everything there. Some of his freight, the less valuable stuff. He stores it to save money." Her gaze drifted toward the church steeple, visible through the granary's window. The church has an old cellar, a temporary storeroom. They rent it out. The Reverend mentioned last month that Mr. Harrow had rented it to store excess building supplies. A slow, dangerous understanding dawned in Silas's eyes. A storeroom, on church property. Used by Harrow, it was discreet, unassuming. The perfect place to conduct business one didn't want advertised. "The Reverend holds the only key," Nora continued, her plan forming as she spoke. "And the Reverend is a good man, but he's a frightened man. He won't give it to us." Silas said flatly. Not to us, Nora corrected gently. But maybe to the concerned schoolteacher. The Reverend Michael was a thin, stooped man with kind, worried eyes. He listened as Nora spoke, her voice a mask of earnest concern. She didn't mention Silas. She spoke of the children, of the great risk of fire in the dry season. She told him about the oil barrel she had found behind the granary. It was just so reckless, Reverend, she said, her hands clasped together. I feel it's my duty to make sure the entire church property is secure. I'd like to conduct a simple safety inventory of all the storage areas, just to be sure there are no other hazards, especially in the old cellar Mr. Harrow is using. The Reverend wrung his hands, his face a portrait of conflict. He wanted to do the right thing, but Pike Harrow was a powerful member of his congregation. Mr. Harrow is a very careful man. Miss Hale, I'm sure his supplies are perfectly safe. I'm sure you're right, Nora agreed, her voice soft and persuasive. This is just for my own peace of mind, for the safety of the children. It would be a terrible thing if the church were seen as negligent. That was the word that did it, negligent. The Reverend blanched, with a sigh of resignation that seemed to pull all the air from his lungs. He went to a small wooden box on his desk and produced a heavy, ornate iron key. Be quick, Miss Hale, he whispered, pressing it into her hand. And be discreet. That night, under the sliver of a new moon, they moved. The cellar was behind the church, its heavy wooden doors secured by a large, rusty padlock. The Reverend's key slid into the lock with a grating sound that seemed deafening in the stillness. The doors groaned open, releasing a wave of cool, musty air that smelled of damp earth and old secrets. Inside, they lit a single, shielded lantern, its light a small, brave circle in the oppressive darkness. The cellar was larger than they expected, a cavernous space filled with crates of nails, barrels of tar, and stacks of raw lumber. It was a maze of legitimate building supplies. For a frantic hour, they searched, their hope beginning to fade. They found nothing. Then Silas's foot struck something that wasn't stone or dirt, a loose floorboard. He knelt, prying it up with his fingertips. Beneath it was a small, hollow space, and in that space was a long, tin deed box. It was locked. Silas didn't hesitate. He took a crowbar from a nearby stack of tools and, with a single, sharp crack of protesting metal, forced the lock inside. Nestled among a few legal papers was a ledger. It was a simple, black-bound book. On the cover, in neat gold leaf, were the words, Maintenance Supplies. It looked perfectly ordinary, but when Nora opened it, she knew they had found what they were looking for. It was not a record of supplies. It was a record of men. There were no full names, only initials or crude nicknames, J.B., Rattler, Lefty. Next to each name was a series of dates and figures. The payments were small, but regular, and beside each payment was a brief. Coded notation, Night Watch, Dry Willow, Patrol, Freight Security. The dates corresponded with every known act of intimidation in the valley over the last 6 months, and on a line dated 2 days ago. Next to the initials J.B. and Rattler was an entry, Bonus Special Project. This was it. The Black Book. The Rosetta Stone of Pike Harrow's quiet war. There was no time to take it. Its absence would be noticed immediately. They had to copy it, in the flickering lantern light. Nora's pencil flew across the spare pages of a notebook she had brought. Her skill at shorthand, a novelty she had learned from a traveling journalist, was now the most important weapon they possessed. She copied every initial, every date, every damning notation. Silas stood guard, holding the lantern steady, his eyes constantly scanning the dark corners of the cellar. They worked in a fever of concentration, making 2 complete copies, one for him, one for her. When she was done, she carefully returned the ledger to the tin box, and Silas replaced the floorboard, scattering dust over it to hide their work. Nora tucked her copy into a hidden pocket in her skirt. She gave the other to Silas. As they were about to leave, Nora paused. She walked back to the granary. a single thought guiding her. She lifted a loose board beneath her own desk, a place she had long ago discovered, and placed her precious, copied ledger inside, wrapping it in an oilcloth to protect it from the damp. A fail-safe, an anchor. They returned to the church cellar to make one last check, to ensure everything looked undisturbed. As Silas gently closed the heavy cellar doors, they swung open. Pike Harrow stood there, a dark, immaculate silhouette against the faint starlight. He held a small lantern of his own, its light catching the surprise and fear on their faces. Behind him stood one of his guards, the one with the cross-cleat boots. "Reverend Michael told me a schoolteacher was conducting a safety inspection," Harrow said, his voice a silken, dangerous purr. He stepped into the cellar, his cold eyes sweeping over them, over the stacks of supplies, searching for anything out of place. The air crackled with tension. Silas instinctively moved to place himself slightly in front of Nora, his body a silent shield. He could feel the weight of the copied ledger inside his coat, a secret that felt as heavy and as hot as a blacksmith's iron. But Nora did not flinch. She summoned every ounce of her composure, her face becoming a mask of polite, professional concern. "Mr. Harrow," she said, her voice steady. "I'm so glad you're here. I was just telling Silas that with winter coming, I'll need a better supply of candles for the classroom. I was hoping you might know of a brand that burns safely, one that doesn't sputter. For the children's sake, of course." It was a masterful performance. She had taken his own weapon, the threat of fire, and turned it into a shield of mundane domesticity. Harrow's eyes narrowed. He looked from her earnest, open face to Silas's stony, unreadable expression. He could sense something was wrong. The air was too thick with unspoken things, but he had no proof. They were two concerned citizens in a church cellar, discussing candles. To accuse them of anything else would be to reveal his own paranoia. He gave a thin, dismissive smile. "I'm a banker, Miss Hale, not a candle maker. I suggest you consult the general store." He turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. "Just see to it that you are careful with your flames." The threat was clear. He cast one last, long, suspicious look at them, and then was gone, the heavy doors closing with a thud that echoed in the silence. Silas and Nora were left alone in the darkness, their hearts pounding. Silas slowly let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. His hand, which had been resting protectively over the copied ledger inside his coat, was slick with sweat. They had walked into the lion's den, and for now, they had walked out. And they were carrying its teeth. The rain began at noon, a change in the air before the first drop fell. The sky, which had been a high, indifferent blue, bruised to a sullen purple gray. It was not a gentle autumn shower, but a cold, driving downpour, the kind that turned roads to rivers and hope to mud. Inside the granary, Nora was packing the last of her students' slates when she saw the riders, two of them, moving fast from the direction of the railroad office. They weren't riding aimlessly. They were searching, their heads turning, their eyes scanning the town with a new, frantic urgency. Pike Harrow knew. He must have checked the cellar, found the tin box, and realized his secrets were no longer safe. The hunt had begun. Silas was already there, his horse saddled, his face grim. He had seen them, too. There was no need for discussion, no time for debate. Their quiet investigation was over. Now, they were fugitives. "Judge Quinn is sitting in Rock Creek until Friday," Silas said, his voice a low rumble beneath the drumming of rain on the roof. "It's a half-day ride. If we can get to him, show him what we have. He's an honest man," Nora finished, pulling her oilskin coat tight around her shoulders. "He'll listen." She retrieved her copy of the ledger from its hiding place beneath the floorboards, wrapping the precious notebook in a second layer of oilcloth before securing it deep within an inside pocket. Silas had his copy tucked away just as carefully. They had the evidence, but evidence was worthless if they were caught before they could present it. They rode out the back of the town, avoiding the main street, their horses' hooves making sucking, grasping sounds in the deepening mud. The rain plastered Nora's hair to her face and ran in cold rivulets down her neck. Her heavy coat was a leaden weight, the wet leather sticking to her back. Beside her, Silas rode with a tense, coiled stillness, his eyes constantly moving, scanning the landscape. The world had been reduced to a gray, slanting curtain of water, the low hills dissolving into mist. Their only path lay west, toward Rock Creek, a path that would force them to cross the old wooden bridge at Willow Creek. The creek, usually a placid, meandering stream, was transformed. It was a churning, angry torrent of brown water, swollen with runoff from the hills. It tore at its banks, carrying branches and debris in its swift current. As they approached, the sound of the water was a constant, hungry roar, and above it, another sound, the tortured groaning of old wood under strain. The Willow Creek Bridge. It was a rickety, skeletal structure, its timbers blackened with age and damp. It sagged in the middle, and the roar of the water beneath it was a terrifying thing. But as they drew closer, it wasn't the state of the bridge that made Silas pull his horse to a sudden, sharp halt. Two men stood at the far end, blocking their way. They were broad-shouldered figures in long, dark dusters, their hats pulled low against the rain. Even at this distance, Silas recognized them. J, B, and Rattler, the same initials from Harrow's Black Book. They stood with a deliberate, casual menace. Two wolves waiting at the only crossing. They were waiting for us, Silas said, his voice flat. They knew this was our only way, Nora replied, her own voice steady despite the cold that had nothing to do with the rain. They had no choice but to ride forward. To turn back was to be run down in the open. They approached the bridge slowly, their horses picking their way carefully through the slick mud. The air grew thick with tension. The two men didn't move until Silas and Nora were at the mouth of the bridge. "Hold up there, the bigger man," J.A.B. called out, his voice a gravelly rasp. He took a step forward, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "We're checking all travelers. Orders from the railroad." Checking for what Silas asked, his tone hard and even. Rattler, the smaller man with a weasel-like face, grinned. It was not a pleasant sight. "Contraband. Got a report of stolen goods. We'll need to have a look in your saddlebags. Need you to light a lantern so we can see proper." The demand was a blade disguised as a request. A lantern. They wanted light. They wanted to see their faces clearly, to search their bags, to find the ledgers. They wanted to turn this muddy creek bank into an interrogation room. It was a test of nerve, a trap laid in plain sight. Nora leaned slightly towards Silas, her face shielded from the men by the angle of her horse. Her whisper was so low it was almost lost in the roar of the creek. "Don't light a candle for them to see." It was the echo of their first real conversation, a reminder of their pact. Light was a weapon their enemies used. To obey was to surrender. Silas gave a barely perceptible nod. He didn't reply to Rattler's demand. His eyes were on the water, gauging its depth, its speed. He saw a line of submerged rocks that created a slight riffle, a place where the bottom might be shallower, the current less treacherous. It was a desperate gamble. His decision was made in a heartbeat. He pulled hard on Bess's reins, turning the mare abruptly away from the bridge. With a sharp kick to her flanks, he urged her down the slick, muddy bank and into the raging creek. The shock of the cold water was a physical blow. It surged around the horse's legs, pulling and sucking at them. Bess panicked for a second, her eyes rolling, but Silas's firm hand and steady voice calmed her. He steered her diagonally across the current, aiming for the riffle he had spotted. "What in blazes J.B.?" shouted, his surprise turning instantly to rage. A gunshot exploded, the sound flat and ugly in the wet air. It was deafeningly close. Nora felt a sharp, stinging spray against her cheek and saw a long, white sliver of bark fly from the trunk of a cottonwood tree just past Silas's head. He hadn't hesitated. He had simply drawn his pistol and fired. Silas reacted without thinking. He swung his body low, using the bulk of his horse and the thick leather of his saddle as a shield. "Go!" he yelled at Nora, his voice raw. "Move!" Nora didn't need to be told. She was already urging her own horse down the bank, following his path into the churning water. The current was a living thing, a powerful beast trying to drag them downstream. Her horse stumbled, and for a terrifying moment, she thought they were going down. She held on, her knuckles white on the reins, and kicked hard. Hiya! The horse found its footing and lunged forward, water spraying high into the air. Another shot rang out, this one whizzing past her head with an angry hiss. They were in the middle of the creek now, completely exposed. Silas, riding just ahead, pointed toward the far bank. There was a thick, tangled grove of willow trees, their long branches trailing in the rushing water. "Cover!" They pushed the horses hard, the animals straining against the force of the creek. They reached the far bank, a steep, muddy incline that seemed impossible to climb. Silas's mare, Bess, dug her hooves in, scrambling for purchase, her powerful legs churning. She found a root and, with a great heave, pulled herself onto solid ground. Nora's horse followed, sliding back once before finding its own footing and lunging up onto the bank. They didn't stop. They plunged into the willow grove, the long, wet branches whipping at their faces. Behind them, they could hear the angry shouts of Harrow's men, the sounds muffled by the rain and the dense foliage. They pushed deeper into the thicket, the world becoming a claustrophobic tangle of green and gray. Finally, when he judged they were deep enough, Silas slid from his saddle, pulling a winded Bess to a halt. Nora did the same. They stood in a small, sheltered pocket, the sound of the raging creek on one side and the thick curtain of willows on the other. The drumming of the rain on the leaves above was a steady, rhythmic noise that masked their own ragged breathing. They were soaked, freezing, but they were alive, and they were across. They heard the men crashing along the creek bank, their voices raw with frustration. "Where'd they go, Jay?" B bellowed. "Can't have gone far. Spread out, find them," Rattler yelled back. Silas put a calming hand on Bess's muzzle, whispering to her. Nora did the same for her horse, her own heart pounding in time with the animals. They were hidden, but for how long the sound of the rushing water, their enemy in the crossing, was now their ally, swallowing the small sounds of their presence. They heard one of the men getting closer, his heavy footsteps squelching in the mud just beyond their hiding place. The willow branches rustled. The man was pushing his way through, searching. He was dangerously close, so close Nora could hear the rasp of his breathing. Silas motioned for her to stay still. He flattened himself against the trunk of a large willow, his body taut as a coiled spring. The branches parted. Rattler stepped into their small clearing, his pistol drawn, his beady eyes scanning the shadows. He took another step onto the slick, moss-covered ground near the water's edge, and his foot went out from under him. He yelped, his arms flailing for balance. For a single, unguarded moment, his pistol was pointed at the sky, his focus entirely on his fall. Silas exploded from the shadows. He moved with a speed and ferocity that was terrifying. He didn't punch. He hit Rattler with his entire body, a driving, unstoppable force. The impact sent both men tumbling to the ground with a heavy, wet thud. Rattler's head struck a thick willow root with a sickening crack, and his pistol flew from his grasp, landing in the mud. He lay stunned, the air driven from his lungs. Before the man could recover, Silas was on him, a knee pinning his chest, one hand clamping over his mouth to stifle any shout for help. It was over in less than 3 seconds. Nora moved just as quickly. There was no hesitation. She grabbed a coil of rope from her saddle, and with practiced, efficient motions, she looped it around Rattler's wrist. Silas dragged the man's other arm behind his back, and Nora secured them both tightly to the thick, exposed root of the willow tree. The man was their prisoner. J.B. was still shouting in the distance, his voice sounding farther away now. He hadn't heard the brief scuffle over the roar of the creek. Silas quickly frisked their captive. In the man's coat pocket, his fingers found a folded, oil-stained piece of paper. He pulled it out. It wasn't a copy of the requisition slip he had found earlier. This was a delivery confirmation. It listed the same 5 gallons of kerosene, but at the bottom, below the warehouse foreman's signature, was another line, scrawled in a barely legible hand, "Received for project at Dry Willow," and beside it, a signature, J. Rattler. Silas and Nora looked at each other over the groaning form of their captive. The rain dripped from the leaves, and the creek roared on. They had it, the final, undeniable piece of the puzzle, the paper that tied the fuel, the plan, and the man himself together in a single, damning document. It was the legal link, the signed confession they needed. They had the rope, and now they had the man at the end of it. The hearing was not held in a courthouse, but in the Rock Creek Town Hall, a large, drafty room that smelled of wet wool and simmering tension. It was a semi-formal affair, a frontier court convened out of necessity. Judge Alistair Quinn presided, a man whose face seemed carved from the same granite as the surrounding hills. He sat behind a simple pine table, his eyes missing nothing. The room was packed. People from Ash Hollow and the surrounding ranches stood along the walls, their faces a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. This was more than a legal dispute. It was entertainment, a drama playing out that would shape the future of their community. Pike Harrow stood first. He was the picture of composure, dressed in a fine city suit that seemed to repel the room's damp chill. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture wildly. He simply and methodically placed a series of documents on the judge's table. The loan agreement, the default notices, the new insurance clause. His presentation was a masterpiece of cold, irrefutable logic. "Judge Quinn," he began, his voice calm and reasonable. "The facts of this matter are not in dispute. Mr. Cole secured a loan against his property, Dry Willow. The terms were clear. The payment schedule was generous." He tapped a finger on the topmost document. "Due to a series of unfortunate circumstances, Mr. Cole has failed to meet his obligations. The contract is clear on the consequences of such a default. The property reverts to the creditor. That is me." He folded his hands and took a half step back. "I take no pleasure in this. It is simply business. The law is the law." A murmur went through the crowd. It was hard to argue with. A contract was a sacred thing in the West. A man's word, a man's signature, was his bond. The law was indeed the law. Judge Quinn studied the papers, his expression unreadable. He looked up, his gaze shifting from Harrow to the 2 figures standing beside the plaintiff's table. "Mr. Cole, Miss Hale. Do you dispute the validity of this contract?" Silas stood rigid, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The legal language was a cage he didn't know how to unlock. He opened his mouth to speak, but it was Nora who stepped forward. She moved with a quiet grace that commanded the room's attention. "We do not dispute the contract, Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and steady. "We dispute the methods used to enforce it." She began to lay out their own evidence on the table, a stark, pathetic-looking collection compared to Harrow's crisp legal forms. First, she placed the small, mud-caked scrap of a leather glove. This was found on Mr. Cole's property after his barn was broken into and an attempt was made to set it on fire. She explained, "The mud, Your Honor, is a specific red clay found in only one place in this county, the Clay Ridge Mine." She paused, letting the implications settle in the silent room. A mine owned by Mr. Harrow. Next, she placed her carefully drawn sketch of the boot print with the cross-shaped cleat. "This is the print left by the man who placed a barrel of oil behind my classroom, a building constructed of wood and filled with straw. It is the same print one can find all over the grounds of Mr. Harrow's railroad office, made by the guards in his employ." Harrow's composure remained, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. Then, Nora laid down the 2 notebooks, her copy and the one Silas carried, "And this, Your Honor, is a copy of a private ledger kept by Mr. Harrow. It details payments made to his guards for activities described as night watch and special projects at Dry Willow." The murmur in the room grew louder, no longer sympathetic to Harrow, but buzzing with shock and speculation. Nora's final piece of evidence was the oil delivery slip signed by the man they had captured. Finally, This is a delivery confirmation for 5 gallons of kerosene, signed by one of the men who attacked us at Willow Creek, explicitly stating the fuel was received for a project at Dry Willow. She looked directly at Judge Quinn, her eyes holding his. A contract is indeed the law, Mr. Harrow. But so is the law against conspiracy, intimidation, and attempted arson. We are not asking for charity. Your Honor, we are asking for the light of truth. Pike Harrow let out a short, dismissive laugh. It was a chilling sound, devoid of humor. He stepped forward again, his eyes glittering with malice. The light of truth, he scoffed, his voice dripping with condescension. Or the flickering, dangerous flame of incompetence, Your Honor. This is a desperate fiction, a fantasy woven by a failing rancher and a woman with an overactive imagination. He gestured toward Silas. This is a man whose property already burned once under mysterious circumstances, a fire in which his own brother perished, a man known for his temper, a man drowning in debt. Is it not more likely that he himself would start a fire, hoping for an insurance payment? He then turned his venomous gaze on Nora. And what about the rumors from the night of the supposed attack? I hear there was a great deal of commotion, a rifle shot. Perhaps Miss Hale, working late by her infamous candlelight, grew careless. Perhaps a candle did fall, and this entire story is a fabrication to cover their own culpability. He was trying to turn their own strategy against them, to twist the narrative, to paint them as the villains of the story he had written for them. He wanted to nail the crime he had conceived to their door. The crowd stirred uneasily. The rumors were true. They had all heard them. The story, as Harrow told it, had a grim plausibility. Judge Quinn looked at Silas. Mr. Cole, you heard the accusation. What do you have to say about this candle? All eyes in the room turned to Silas. He was not a man of many words. He had never been comfortable as the center of attention. He felt the weight of every stare, the pressure of 100 judgments. He looked at Harrow's smug, confident face, then at Nora's pale but resolute expression. He thought of the long, dark nights, of the fear and the waiting. He took a single step forward. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried to every corner of the room, a low, steady sound that cut through the whispers. "We didn't light a flame," he said, his eyes locked on the judge. "Not a candle, not a lantern. We sat in the dark because we knew they were coming." He turned his head slowly, his gaze sweeping over the faces in the crowd before finally landing on Pike Harrow. They needed a fire to make their story true. We didn't give them one. The simplicity and raw honesty of his words silenced the room. There was no artifice, no legal maneuvering, just the plain, unvarnished truth. It rang with an authority that Harrow's smooth, practiced lies could not match. Judge Quinn leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled before him. He was silent for a full minute, studying the evidence, studying the faces of the 3 people before him. The fate of Dry Willow, and perhaps of the entire town, hung in that silence. "Mr. Harrow," the judge said finally, his voice firm, "the evidence presented by Miss Hale is compelling. The accusations are of the most serious nature." He picked up Nora's notebook. "This ledger, a copy though it may be, requires investigation. The signed delivery slip requires a witness." He fixed Harrow with a hard stare. "I am therefore issuing a temporary injunction. All foreclosure proceedings against the property known as Dry Willow are hereby suspended for a period of 3 days, pending verification of this evidence." A collective gasp went through the crowd. "Furthermore," the judge continued, his voice rising with authority, "I am placing an immediate embargo on the transport or sale of all kerosene and other flammable oils from the Harrow and Company warehouse until this matter is resolved. The marshal will see to it." Pike Harrow's face, for the first time, lost its mask of composure. A dark flush rose from his collar. He looked as if he had been slapped. He opened his mouth to protest, but the judge raised a hand, silencing him. "That is my ruling. This hearing is adjourned." As the judge stood, the spell was broken. The room erupted in a low roar of conversation. People crowded together, whispering, arguing, their allegiances shifting like the dust on the prairie. Silas saw men who had avoided his gaze for months now looking at him with a grudging respect. He saw women nodding in Nora's direction, their eyes filled with a newfound admiration. They had not won, not yet, but they had bought time. They had brought the truth into a place where it could not be ignored. They slipped out of the town hall while the crowd was still buzzing. The rain had softened to a fine, gray drizzle that hung in the air like a veil. The world was quiet again, the violence of the creek and the courtroom replaced by a weary, sodden peace. They stood together on the wooden steps, the damp air cool on their flushed cheeks. Silas looked at Nora, at the way the misty rain collected like tiny diamonds in her dark hair. He was overwhelmed by a feeling he couldn't name, a gratitude so profound it was painful. He had been a man alone, a ghost haunting the ruins of his own life. She had walked into his darkness and shown him how to fight. He felt an urge, powerful and undeniable, to reach out, to take her hand, to feel the warmth of her skin against his. His hand started to move, his fingers uncurling, but he stopped. His hand was rough, calloused, stained with the mud and struggle of his life. Hers were the hands that mended books, that taught children, that wrote down the truth. The fight wasn't over. The running wasn't done. It wasn't time. He let his hand fall back to his side. "When the running is over," he said, his voice low and thick with unspoken emotion. "I promise." Nora looked up at him, her lips curving into a small, tired smile. She understood what he wasn't saying. She understood the gesture he hadn't made. "Promise with deeds, Silas," she said softly, her voice a counterpoint to the gentle hiss of the rain. "Not with candles." The news from Rock Creek traveled faster than the rain had fallen. For 2 days, Ash Hollow buzzed with it. Judge Quinn's injunction was a stone dropped into a stagnant pond, its ripples disrupting the quiet, fearful surface of the town. People spoke in hushed tones in the general store, their conversations stopping abruptly when one of Pike Harrow's men walked in. The town was holding its breath, caught between the old reality of Harrow's power and the new, fragile possibility of justice. Nora Hale did not wait for the law to run its course. She knew that the law was a slow, grinding machine, and that Pike Harrow was an expert at throwing sand in its gears. She needed something more. She needed to turn the court of public opinion, a court that had already condemned Silas, into their greatest ally. The idea came to her not in a flash of brilliance, but in a moment of simple necessity. She was looking at her dwindling supply of lamp oil, doing the hard math of a teacher's salary, and thought of the expense. Then she thought of Silas's cattle, thin and in need of feed to survive the coming winter. The two ideas connected, and a plan, audacious and simple, was born. She posted a notice on the door of the church and another on the community board outside the general store. It was written in her neat, clear teacher's hand. It announced a no-light reading night to be held at the granary on the evening of the 3rd day, the day before Judge Quinn's injunction was set to expire. The stated purpose was twofold: to conserve precious oil for the coming winter, and to raise a small fund, through donations of coin or feed, to help a local rancher's herd survive. The notice didn't mention Silas by name, but everyone knew whose herd was on the brink. It was an open declaration of support, a challenge disguised as a charity event. The day of the event. Silas rode out to the spot near his barn where the kerosene-soaked rags had been left. The ground was still dark and stained. He took a piece of chalk from his pocket, the kind Nora used on her slates, and drew a thick white circle around the entire area. He did the same where Nora had found the oil barrel behind the granary. The marks were stark and white against the dark earth, questions waiting for an answer. That evening, the people of Ash Hollow came. At first, they came in trickles, drawn by curiosity as much as charity. They saw the granary, its big doors thrown open, not with a blaze of lamps, but with a soft, welcoming glow from a few carefully placed, shielded candles. Nora greeted each person with a quiet smile, accepting a handful of oats here, a few coins there, dropping them into a wooden collection box. The children, excited by the novelty of it all, were given sheets of clean white paper. Silas stood near the back, a silent, watchful presence. He was uncomfortable, unused to being the center of so much attention. But he stood his ground. He saw the looks he received, the mix of pity, suspicion, and a new, dawning respect. Pike Harrow arrived, flanked by his two most trusted guards, J, B, and Rattler's replacement. He walked in as if he owned the place, a condescending smile on his face, dropping a single, ostentatious silver dollar into the collection box. He had come to watch this foolish little rebellion fail. And to Nora's surprise and relief, Judge Quinn appeared, taking a quiet seat on a hay bale near the door. He wasn't there in any official capacity. He'd said, just as a citizen of the county, interested in the town's welfare. When the granary was full, Nora stood before them. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice carrying in the hushed room. "Tonight, we are going to try an experiment. For generations, we have relied on the sun and the moon to see. Tonight, we will honor that tradition. In a moment, I will ask Mr. Cole to extinguish these last few candles. I ask you all, if you have a lamp lit in your homes, to put it out for just a few minutes, to join us in this moment of quiet. Let us see what the night itself has to show us." She gave Silas a nod. He moved to each of the 4 candles, and with a soft puff of breath, extinguished them one by one. As the last flame died, the room was plunged into a deep, velvety blackness. A few of the younger children gasped. The town fell silent, and in that silence, one by one, the lights in the windows of Ash Hollow went out. The saloon, the general store, the blacksmith's shop. A wave of darkness swept over the town, a communal act of trust. For a long minute, they were all blind, adrift in a sea of nothing. The only sounds were the soft whisper of the wind outside and the collective, held breath of the town. And then, slowly, magically, the world began to reappear. Their eyes, freed from the glare of artificial light, began to adjust. The huge, open doors of the granary became a vast, silver screen. A full moon, brilliant and clear in the rain-washed sky, flooded the room with its pale, ethereal light. It wasn't the warm, focused light of a lamp. It was a cool, democratic light that touched everything and everyone equally. "Now," Nora's voice said, soft in the magical quiet, the children, who had been waiting for their cue, held up their sheets of white paper. They angled them toward the open doors, and the paper caught the moonlight, turning each sheet into a soft, glowing page. A low murmur of wonder went through the crowd as the children began to read aloud in a soft chorus from their primers, their voices clear in the silvered air. When they finished, Nora spoke again. "Sometimes," she said, her voice resonating in the stillness, "we have to turn off the lamps to see things more clearly." She stepped out of the granary, and the crowd, drawn by her words, followed her. They moved not as a mob, but as a single, curious body. She led them to the side of the building. "When your eyes have adjusted," she said, pointing, "look." At first, they saw nothing but the dark ground, but as their vision sharpened, they saw it. The thick, white chalk circle Silas had drawn, and inside it, a dark, ugly stain on the earth. "This is where a barrel of oil was placed," Nora said simply. Intended, perhaps, to be blamed on a schoolteacher's fallen candle. She then led them across the open ground toward Silas's barn, the crowd following in a silent, moonlit procession. They stopped before the second white circle. "And this," she said, her voice ringing with a cold anger, "is where kerosene was poured on Mr. Cole's barn, where men waited in the dark for a light to appear so they could create a story of guilt." The people stared at the white circles, at the dark stains on the land. In the honest, impartial light of the moon, the evidence was undeniable. The abstract rumors they had heard were now given a physical, damning form. These were not just stories. They were scars on the land. A voice, sharp and clear, cut through the silence. It was Martha, the saloon keeper's wife, a woman with a keen eye and a sharper tongue. She was pointing, not at the ground, but at the feet of the guard standing beside Pike Harrow. "Those boots," she said, her voice ringing with certainty. "I know those boots." The guard instinctively took a half-step back. "Pike Harrow's man there came into my husband's saloon last week, complaining about a loose cleat. I took them to the cobbler for him myself. I'd know that cross-shaped stud anywhere." Every eye in the crowd now turned to the guard, whose face had gone pale in the moonlight. He looked at Harrow for help, but Harrow's face was a mask of cold fury. Then, another voice joined in, hesitant but firm. It was the Reverend Michael. He stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly, but his eyes were clear. "The key," he said, his voice stronger than anyone had ever heard it. "Miss Hale is right about the church storeroom. Mr. Harrow did indeed borrow the key. He was the only person who had it on the day that oil barrel appeared behind her classroom." The pieces were clicking into place. Not in a courtroom, but in the minds of the people of Ash Hollow. The boot print, the oil, the key. The chain of evidence was being forged before their eyes. Harrow's men, caught in the glare of 100 pairs of eyes, began to panic. They were surrounded, their escape cut off by a wall of silent, accusing neighbors. J.B., the bigger of the two, blurted out, his voice a panicked bleat. "We didn't mean no real harm." The new man beside him, desperate to save his own skin, added, his voice cracking. "We was just doing what we was told, following orders, the admission." A desperate, foolish cry in the dark, hung in the air like a death sentence. It was a confession, uttered not under oath, but under the immense pressure of a community's focused gaze. A figure detached itself from the edge of the crowd. It was Judge Quinn. He had seen and heard everything. He held a small notebook and a pencil. In the pale moonlight, he made a few swift notes. "I believe I have seen enough," he said, his voice carrying the full weight of the law. He looked at Pike Harrow, whose face was a thunderous mask of disbelief. "Mr. Harrow, these are serious allegations, now corroborated by multiple witnesses and a confession." He turned to the town marshal, a stout man who had been watching the proceedings with a bewildered expression. "Marshal, you will take these two men into custody." He pointed at Harrow's guards. "And you will conduct a full and immediate search of the Harrow and Company warehouse. I am signing the warrant now." Pike Harrow stood frozen, his empire of fear and intimidation crumbling around him in the soft, silent moonlight. There were no candles, no sputtering lamps to cast confusing shadows. There was only the high, bright moon, and in its unwavering light, the truth was not blinding. It was simply, finally, clear. The dawn that broke over Ash Hollow was not a fiery spectacle, but a quiet, cleansing light. It found the town marshal and two deputies standing before the heavy doors of the Harrow and Company warehouse, a signed warrant from Judge Quinn in hand. The search was methodical, conducted not in the heat of anger, but in the cold, clear light of day. It did not take them long. In a locked back office, hidden beneath a false bottom in a crate marked machine parts, they found it, the original black ledger. Nora's painstakingly copied notes were a perfect, damning mirror of the entries within. They found stacks of signed requisition slips for kerosene and other supplies, far more than a simple railroad concern would ever need. And they found the lists. Scrawled on cheap paper were schedules for what the ledger called night checks, detailing the movements and habits of ranchers and homesteaders who had fallen behind on their payments. At the top of one list, underlined twice, was the name Cole. The final judgment was delivered that afternoon. The town hall was even more crowded than before, but the atmosphere was different. The tension was gone, replaced by a somber, watchful silence. Pike Harrow was there, but he stood alone, his guards in the town's single jail cell. He looked smaller, his fine suit somehow ill-fitting, his composure replaced by a tight, brittle arrogance. Judge Quinn did not waste time on rhetoric. He spoke in a flat, measured voice, laying out the facts as if they were stones in a foundation. He read from the original ledger, his voice ringing in the silent room. He held up the oil delivery slip signed by Rattler. He cited the corroborating testimony of the saloon keeper's wife and the Reverend Michael. In light of this evidence, the judge concluded, his eyes fixed on Pike Harrow. This court finds a clear and undeniable pattern of criminal conspiracy, intimidation, and attempted fraud. He then picked up the loan agreement between Harrow and Silas. The law is indeed the law, Mr. Harrow. It protects the rights of the creditor, but it does not protect the practice of usury or the deliberate sabotage of a debtor's ability to meet his obligations. He tore a page from the agreement. A list of added fees and penalties. This court declares all such punitive and unreasonable fees attached to this loan to be null and void. A wave of shock rippled through the room. Furthermore, the judge continued, his voice like iron. The original terms of the loan will be restructured. The payment schedule will be extended and tied not to an arbitrary calendar, but to the reality of this land. It will be based on the grass season, with payments due after the cattle have been brought to market. He looked at Silas. The interest rate will be halved. Silas stood, stunned into silence. It was more than he could have ever hoped for. It was not forgiveness. It was a chance, a fair chance. The judge was not finished. He turned his gaze back to Harrow. Pike Harrow, you are hereby fined a sum that will be sufficient to cover the court's expenses and to compensate Mr. Cole for damages. Your lease on the Clay Ridge mine is terminated, effective immediately, due to its use in criminal activity, and a formal complaint will be lodged with the Union Pacific Railroad, recommending your immediate replacement as territorial supervisor. He slammed his gavel down. The sound a final, decisive crack. The law has spoken. Pike Harrow's empire, built on whispers and paper, had been dismantled by the truth. The next morning, as the sun was burning the last of the mist from the valley, a wagon pulled up the lane to Dry Willow. It was Mr. Gable, the blacksmith, a man who hadn't spoken a word to Silas in over a year. He got down from the seat without a word and began unloading new cedar fence posts. A few minutes later, 2 more ranchers arrived, carrying rolls of wire and tools. Then another. By mid-morning, a dozen men from Ash Hollow were working in the cool autumn air, their hammers rising and falling in a steady, rhythmic chorus. They were rebuilding the section of fence that had been trampled by the panicked cattle, but they were doing more than that. They were mending a tear in the fabric of the community. It was a silent apology, a communal act of atonement for the months of suspicion and ostracism. No one spoke of the hearing. No one mentioned Pike Harrow. They simply worked, their shared labor a language more powerful than words. Silas worked alongside them, his face a mask of stoicism, but the tight, defensive set of his shoulders had eased for the first time in years. Martha, the saloon-keeper's wife, arrived with a large pot of hot coffee, her presence a clear statement that the women of the town stood with their men. They were ashamed of the rumors they had helped to spread, and this was their way of making it right. Nora received the letter 2 days later. It arrived with the weekly mail rider, a crisp, clean envelope that stood out from the usual collection of bills and catalogs. The postmark was from Cheyenne. She opened it in the quiet of her empty classroom, the scent of chalk dust and old paper a familiar comfort. The letter was from the Territorial Education Board. It was a formal offer of employment. They had heard of her work in Ash Hollow, of her resourcefulness and dedication. They were offering her the position of head librarian for the new Cheyenne Municipal Library and Reading Room. The salary was more than double what she was making now. The letter spoke of a large, well-lit reading room, of a budget for new books, of a community eager for knowledge. She read the letter twice, her heart a confusion of pride and a deep, aching sadness. Cheyenne. It was a world away from the dust and hardship of Ash Hollow. It was a world of stability, of respectability. It was everything she had ever dreamed of. A large, clean room filled with books and light. It was a safe harbor. It was an escape. She folded the letter and tucked it into her pocket, the clean, sharp edges of the paper feeling like a betrayal against her skin. That evening, as twilight settled over the valley, Silas came to the granary. The children had long since gone home, and Nora was sitting at her desk, staring out the open doors at the fields, which were turning from gold to a soft, dusky purple in the fading light. He didn't ride up on his horse. He walked, his steps quiet on the dusty path, He carried no rifle, no tools in his hands. He held the lumpy, newspaper-wrapped bundle of candles he had bought what felt like a lifetime ago. He stopped in the doorway, his large frame filling the space. He didn't speak for a long moment, simply stood there, watching her. Then he stepped inside and walked to her desk. He placed the bundle of candles on the rough wooden surface. They looked cheap and out of place next to her neat stacks of books and papers. "I bought these," he said, his voice low and a little rough. He cleared his throat. "I bought them a while back. I told myself it was for the rats, but that was a lie." He looked at her, his eyes honest and direct. "I bought them to have an excuse, a reason to come see you, to thank you." He looked down at the candles, at their unlit, unused wicks. "But then that first night, you said to put out the light. You said to stay in the dark." He raised his eyes to meet hers again. "So I listened." The simple words held a world of meaning. He had trusted her judgment over his own impulse. He had learned a new kind of strength, the strength of patience, of waiting. The silence in the room was warm and soft, filled with unspoken things. He looked at the candles, then back at her, a question in his eyes that was deeper and more important than any that had been asked in the town hall. "Can we light them now?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Nora didn't answer right away. Her gaze drifted past him, out the open doors to the vast, open land of dry willow. Now secure, now his own again. She saw the new fence, a dark, straight line in the twilight. She smelled the cool, damp air, the scent of curing hay and rich earth. This was a place of hardship and struggle, but it was also a place where a person could see the stars, where a promise was a sacred thing. She thought of the letter in her pocket, of the safe, well-lit room in Cheyenne. She turned her eyes back to him, to his weary, hopeful face, illuminated by the last gentle light of the day. "Light them," she said, her voice soft but sure, "when we need to see each other's faces to speak the truth." She reached out and her hand came to rest on the rough paper of the candle bundle, her fingers brushing his. It was not the touch of a lover. Not yet. It was the touch of a partner, a confirmation of a pact. It was the touch of a promise. The wind, for the first time in what felt like a season, was still. The late afternoon sun poured a thick, golden light over Ash Hollow, a light that seemed to wash the very air clean. Inside the granary, the last of Nora's students were packing their slates, their small, chalk-dusted hands careful and slow. On each slate, copied in the wavering script of a child learning their letters, was a single word: trust. It was their lesson for the day, and as they filed out into the quiet afternoon, their voices carrying in the calm air, Nora knew it was a lesson she herself had finally learned. She did not go back to her small rented room above the general store. Instead, she walked to where her horse was tethered, her movements calm and deliberate. The letter from Cheyenne was a stiff, rectangular weight in her pocket, a crossroads made of paper. She saddled the mare and rode not east toward the promise of a city, but west, toward the setting sun and the quiet silhouette of Dry Willow Ranch. The ride was peaceful. The prairie grasses, which had once seemed so hostile and unforgiving, were now a sea of soft, waving gold. The new fence posts Silas's neighbors had helped him set stood like soldiers on parade, a testament to a community mending itself. She found him not in the fields, but in his small, clean cabin. The door was open, a silent invitation. He was sitting at his table, and on the smooth, scrubbed pine surface, a single, slender tallow candle was burning. Its flame was a small, steady teardrop of gold, unwavering in the still air. It cast a warm, gentle light on his face, softening the hard lines of exhaustion and worry, revealing the quiet strength that had always been there beneath. The room was clean, the floors swept, the blankets on his cot folded. It was a space made ready, a home waiting. He looked up as she entered, and a slow, uncertain smile touched his lips. He gestured to the candle, the first light he had willingly and openly lit in his own home in 3 years. "No lights tonight?" he asked, the words a gentle echo of their past. It was half a joke, a shared memory of the darkness that had forged their bond. But beneath it was a real question. Had things changed? Were they allowed to have light now? Nora smiled, a true, warm smile that reached her eyes. She walked to the table and stood before him, the small, brave flame dancing between them. She looked at the light, then at him, and she knew the answer. The darkness had served its purpose. It had been a shield, a sanctuary, a place where they could find each other without the judging eyes of the world. But its time was over. Now, a different kind of honesty was needed. "Blow it out," she said softly, "so our hearts can speak." He held her gaze for a long moment, a world of understanding passing between them. Then he leaned forward and, with a gentle puff of breath, extinguished the flame. The room was not plunged into the sharp, terrifying blackness of before. The twilight outside was soft and forgiving, filtering through the open door and the single window, filling the cabin with a deep, velvety dimness. It was a darkness that felt like a warm, woolen blanket, a darkness that was safe and intimate. The air was rich with the mingled scents of his world, and hers the sweet, earthy smell of dry hay from the barn, the clean aroma of the pine table he had built, and a faint, lingering scent of ink and paper that seemed to have followed her from the classroom. In that sufficient and gentle dark, they finally spoke the truth. There was no need for grand declarations or passionate speeches. Their words were few, their breaths steady. He spoke of Eli, not with the raw, ragged guilt of a man haunted, but with the quiet, aching sorrow of a brother who missed his family. He spoke of his fear, not of Harrow, but of failing, of losing the one thing his father had left him. He spoke of his hope, a small, fragile thing he had not dared to acknowledge until she had stood by his side. She spoke of her loneliness, of a life spent moving from one temporary place to another, always an outsider. She spoke of her own fear, of trusting too much, of caring for a place that might not care for her in return. And she spoke of the hope he had given her, the feeling of putting down roots in the hard, unforgiving soil of a man's honest heart. When the words were done, and only a comfortable, shared silence remained, Nora reached into her pocket. She pulled out the crisp, clean letter from Cheyenne. In the faint, silvery light from the window, Silas could just make out the official letterhead. He watched as she took the pencil from her apron, and with a single, decisive motion, drew a thick, dark X across the entire page, from one corner to the other. The sound of the graphite scratching the paper was the only sound in the room. Then, in the bottom margin of the letter, in her neat teacher's hand, she wrote a single word: stay. She laid the letter on the table between them. It was not a rejection of a job. It was an acceptance of a life. Silas did not speak. He stood up, took her hand, and led her outside into the cool, evening air. He led her not to the barn, but to the small, windowless shed that had stood beside it, the one that had survived the fire. He had rebuilt the door, and the wood was new and clean. He pushed it open. Inside, it was transformed. He had built shelves along the walls, filling them with the few books he owned and leaving space for more. A sturdy reading table and two simple chairs sat in the center. It smelled of fresh-cut lumber and endless possibility. Hanging on the inside of the door was a new, carefully carved wooden sign. It read, "Dry Willow Lending." He had taken a place of storage, a place of shadows, and built her a library. He had taken his broken, isolated world and made a space for her within it. She turned to him, her eyes shining in the dim light. He reached out, not to take her in his arms, but to gently cup her face in his hands. He lowered his head, and their foreheads touched. It was a gesture of profound, quiet intimacy. Then his lips met hers. It was not a kiss of fiery passion, not the climax of a storybook romance. It was a kiss as gentle as the twilight, a kiss that tasted of dust and rain and second chances. It was a kiss that held no fireworks, only a deep, unwavering promise, a promise of shared sunrises, of hard work, of a long and quiet life built together, side by side. In the distance, across the dark valley, The lamps of Ash Hollow began to flicker on, one by one. Small, hopeful sparks in the vastness of the prairie. But in the soft, private darkness of the small room he had built for her, Silas and Nora had chosen each other. And in that moment, without a single candle to light their way, they saw each other more clearly than they ever had before. Thank you for listening to this story. I'm curious, where in the world are you tuning in from? Let me know in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed our journey to Ash Hollow, please consider subscribing to my channel. Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like and support it further by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.